It was a Friday night when we decided to try something we had heard about in passing, but never truly understood, the Ouija board. My name is Eric, and I was just another 26-year-old man, working a 9-to-5 job, living the ordinary life. My best friend, Jake, who was always the daring one, came across an old Ouija board at a second-hand shop. It looked like it had seen better days, cracked wood, faded letters, the planchette slightly askew. We thought it'd be a laugh. Just another stupid game for the weekend. Come on, Eric. You're not scared, are you? Jake teased, the glint of mischief in his eyes. The rest of our friends, Mia, Brian, and Sophia, had gathered at my apartment. It was one of those warm, humid nights when the air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. We sat in the living room, the candles flickering in the dim light. The board was set up in the center, and we all placed our fingers lightly on the planchette. We weren't expecting much, just a silly thrill. But something was different that night. At first, nothing happened. We laughed, made jokes, and poked fun at the concept. But then, the planchette moved. Not slowly or casually. It slid across the board with surprising speed, stopping at the letter H. Who's messing with it? Mia asked, her voice tight, though she was trying to hide her unease. I swear I'm not touching it, Brian said, looking at everyone in confusion. We all stared at each other. The planchette was still. The room suddenly felt colder. It was one of those uncomfortable silences, like something was watching, waiting. The board had already moved a second time. This time, it went to D. Jake, trying to break the tension, said, "Okay, let's see who's behind this." Without waiting for any volunteers, he asked aloud, "Is there anyone here with us?" The planchette moved again. Slowly, it slid across the letters. Y, it stopped, followed by E, and then S. I laughed nervously. Okay, real funny, someone's trying to mess with us. But no one was moving it. No one had touched the planchette. We were all just sitting there, eyes wide, fingers lightly pressed against it. The air around us felt charged, like static electricity. The board asked us a question. What is your name? The room felt colder, and I could feel my heart start to race. None of us had moved the planchette. None of us were joking. Before anyone could speak, Jake whispered, "Let's just ask something simple. What's your name?" The planchette slid again. It stopped at the letter D. It was clear now that the board was responding. My stomach twisted in knots. Who is D? I asked, the words escaping my mouth before I could stop myself. The planchette slowly slid to D. E. Brian repeated. What is this? But the planchette moved again, and this time, the answer we all got would change everything. It landed on R. Then, it stopped. The board was eerily still. It felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. We were all holding our breaths, unsure of what would happen next. It wasn't a game anymore. The temperature in the room had dropped, and the faint flicker of the candles was the only sound in the silence. The room was uncomfortably cold now, and I could see my breath in the air. It was the middle of summer, and there was no reason for it to be like this. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize everything, but the chill in the air, the feeling of something unseen standing behind me, was impossible to ignore. I shifted uncomfortably, my fingers still resting on the planchette. What happens now? Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette moved again, dragging slowly across the board. It stopped at the letter A. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Something about the way the planchette moved was different this time. It wasn't playful, it wasn't mischievous, it was deliberate. D. E. R. Jake muttered, repeating the letters as if trying to make sense of the name that was forming. Der. But before anyone could finish the word, the planchette slid across the board with a sudden, jerky motion, landing on E. Derek, Brian trailed off, his voice shaking. Who is that? Derek, I muttered under my breath. The name felt strange. Unfamiliar. But at the same time, it resonated deep in my chest, like I had heard it before, though I couldn't place it. A cold wind howled through the window, despite it being closed. We all jumped, and I looked over at Jake, who was visibly pale now. Eric, ask it if it's Derek. We need to know. Reluctantly, I did. Are you Derek? The planchette jerked again. This time, it wasn't a slow slide. It rushed across the board, faster than before, and landed on why yes, I said aloud, confirming the answer. Okay, stop. This is getting way too real, Mia said, her voice cracking. She stood up to leave, but as she did, the room seemed to close in around us, the walls pressing in. Wait, I said, gripping her arm gently. Let's just try to talk to him. Maybe he just wants to communicate. Let's figure out why he's here. Mia's eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded, slowly sitting back down. We all placed our fingers back on the planchette, our hearts pounding in our chests. Before anyone could speak, the lights in the apartment flickered, casting shadows on the walls. I could feel something, a presence, heavy, oppressive, like it was standing in the corner, just watching us. The planchette started moving again, slowly, like it was trying to spell something out. This time, it landed on S. Derek, are you here to hurt us? I asked, almost pleading, desperate for an answer that would put my mind at ease. There was a long pause, and then the planchette shot across the board like it was being pulled by an unseen hand. It stopped at N. My blood ran cold. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. SN, Brian whispered, his voice shaky. What does that mean? SN. The planchette continued its wild motion. It slid across the board and landed on O, SNO. Jake murmured, and then his voice hitched. SNO. No. It's saying no. He's not leaving. The room suddenly felt suffocating, like the air itself was being drained out. The temperature dropped further, and I could see everyone's breath fogging in front of them, even though the window was shut tight. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The only sound was our shallow breathing, and the faint sound of someone, moving in the room with us. In the pitch black, I heard a whisper. It wasn't clear at first, but then it came again, a voice so faint it almost seemed like it was inside my head. Derek is here. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room was suffocating now. My skin prickled with the sensation that something was right behind me, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The board moved again, on its own. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But I had to. When the lights flickered back on, the planchette had moved again. And this time, it wasn't spelling words, it was pointing directly at me. A single, chilling word appeared under the board, run. Panic surged through my body. My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I looked at the word on the board. Run. It felt like a warning. A command. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood up from my seat, almost knocking the chair over. What the hell is happening? Jake whispered, his voice barely audible, but it was the same fear I could hear in every breath. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of the fridge and our shallow breathing. I took a step backward, then another, glancing over my shoulder. My mind was spinning, none of this made sense. We were just playing a game. Just a stupid game. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, dangerously wrong. You need to leave, I heard Sophia say. She was standing by the door, her face pale and panicked. I don't care what's going on, we need to get out of here. But it wasn't that simple. I felt trapped. The air had become thick, like it was pressing down on us, suffocating us. I glanced back at the board. The planchette was still pointing toward me, unmoving. "Eric, we need to go," Brian repeated, his eyes darting toward the door. "Now." Before I could move, the lights flickered again. And this time, they didn't just flicker, they blinked off entirely, plunging us back into darkness. But it wasn't the same as before. This time, the air was heavier, colder. It felt like something was breathing with us. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the floor, like they were being pulled by an invisible force. Then, the whisper came again, but this time it was louder, clearer, coming from somewhere close. "Derek is here. You are not alone." A shiver crawled up my spine. I could feel my throat tighten, my breathing shallow. I tried to speak, but no words came out. Suddenly, I heard something, someone, walking behind me. Soft footsteps, the kind that don't echo but scrape against the floor with every step. My stomach twisted, and I spun around, expecting to see nothing. But there, standing just beyond the reach of the dim candlelight, was a figure. A man, tall, with a shadowy face, his features obscured by darkness. His outline seemed to flicker in and out, like he was part of the darkness itself, blending into it. I could feel his presence, cold and suffocating, as if the very air around me had been replaced with dread. "Derek?" I whispered hoarsely, my voice barely a breath. There was no response, but the temperature dropped further. I could see my own breath in the air again, thick and visible. The figure moved slightly, and I could hear the creak of the floorboards under its weight. The planchette suddenly shot across the board with terrifying speed, landing on the letter D. It was like something had reached into my chest, gripped my heart, and squeezed. The figure in the corner shifted again, and it was like I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I reached out to grab the board, desperate to make sense of this, to ask it how to make it stop, but as soon as my fingers touched it, the planchette began to move violently. It spun across the board, scraping against the surface like nails on a chalkboard. "Derek." I felt a sharp pain in my chest. A crushing weight, like something was pushing against me, suffocating me. The room seemed to spin as the temperature dropped further. My breath was a cloud of white in the air now, and I couldn't move. It felt like my limbs were frozen in place, like they weren't my own anymore. Then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything stopped. The cold, the weight, the oppressive air, it was gone. The room was silent again. The lights flickered back on, and I felt the grip on my chest loosen. I could barely move. My head was spinning, and I was sweating, drenched in cold sweat. My fingers were trembling as I reached for the planchette, which had stopped in the center of the board. "Is he gone?" Jake asked, his voice a whisper. I nodded, though I wasn't sure. The figure in the corner had disappeared. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching us. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. The force of it rattled the entire apartment. I jumped, and everyone screamed, rushing for the door. But when we tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard we pushed, it was locked, and there was no key. We were trapped. I looked around at my friends. Their faces were filled with terror. "We need to get out of here now," Mia said, her voice a frantic whisper. She was shaking so badly she could barely stand. I was about to agree when the planchette began to move again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a single letter, it was something more. It moved slowly, deliberately, and then it spelled out one chilling word. "Leave." Then, the room went completely dark again. And that's when we heard it, the low, guttural growl from somewhere just beyond the edge of the darkness. Something was out there. We had no choice but to listen. We had to run. The air in the room was thick with tension, every second feeling like an eternity. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I could feel the cold seep into my skin, as if the darkness itself was wrapping around me, constricting tighter with every passing moment. The growl from beyond the darkness echoed in my ears, a sound so low, so guttural, that it seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the apartment. "Eric," Jake whispered urgently, his voice trembling. "We have to get out of here." I barely nodded, unable to speak. The words felt heavy on my tongue, and my body was frozen in place. My mind raced, fighting against the overwhelming fear that had taken hold of me. We had to leave. We had to get away from whatever was here with us. The door, still locked, still refusing to open, mocked our every attempt to escape. I pressed my shoulder against it, pushing with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. "Let me try," Brian said, his voice sharp with panic. He rushed to the door, slamming his shoulder against it again and again, but nothing happened. The door didn't even rattle. It felt as though it was sealed by an unseen force. Suddenly, the room grew darker. The lights flickered again, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. Then, I heard it. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave, now." It was the same voice from before, the same voice that had been whispering to us in the dark. But this time, it was closer. Much closer. I spun around, my eyes searching the shadows for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. No figure, no presence, just darkness and the heavy silence that enveloped us. The growl returned, louder now, angrier. It was so close that I could feel it vibrating in my bones, and I knew with a sick certainty that whatever it wasn't going to stop until we were gone. "Come on, guys, hurry." Mia screamed, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the window. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with terror. "We have to break it. Get out, now." Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and slammed it against the window. The glass cracked with a deafening sound, but it didn't break. My hand trembled as I hit it again, harder this time, until the window shattered completely. Cold night air flooded the room, a sharp contrast to the suffocating temperature inside. I climbed through the broken window first, desperate to escape, to get away from whatever was still lurking in the apartment. "Eric! Wait!" Jake shouted, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I was halfway out when I heard something, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming toward the window. My breath caught in my throat as I turned just in time to see the silhouette of a figure in the apartment, standing at the doorway, watching me. It was Derek. Or whatever it was that had been pretending to be Derek. The figure was no longer shadowed. It was clearer now, its features twisted, its face an unrecognizable blur, like it was made of darkness itself. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were black holes, empty, devouring, and they stared right through me. The growl intensified, this time joined by a low, bone-chilling laugh. It echoed in my mind, crawling beneath my skin. "Eric! Get out!" Jake screamed again, his voice full of panic. I didn't need to be told twice. I pushed myself through the broken window, tumbling onto the ground outside. The others followed, scrambling to escape through the shattered glass. My legs were shaking, my whole body shaking, but I kept moving, running, until we were all out of the apartment and into the cool night air. We didn't stop. We couldn't. We ran down the street, hearts pounding, breath ragged. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was chasing us, what was still watching us from that window, from the shadows. We didn't stop until we reached Jake's car, parked on the side of the street. He fumbled for the keys, and once we were inside, locked the doors. It wasn't until then that I allowed myself to breathe again, but even then, it felt like something was still wrong. We all sat there in silence, our bodies tense, our eyes darting nervously from side to side. No one spoke for a long time. We couldn't. The growl was still in my head. I could still feel it, vibrating in my chest. I kept hearing that whisper, that same voice, "Leave, now." But now, it was different. It was close, too close. I could hear it in my ear, like it was right next to me. Then, Jake broke the silence, his voice hoarse and shaken. "We never should have touched that board. We never should have asked it to stay. We don't even know what it was," Brian muttered, his voice trembling. "It wasn't Derek. It was something else. Something worse." "Whatever it was," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "it followed us. And I don't think it's finished." The weight in the car, the feeling of being watched, grew unbearable. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to hold something lurking just out of sight. But it wasn't until we drove away, leaving the apartment behind, that I realized one terrifying truth: the whispering wasn't over. It had followed us. The voice was still with me, still echoing in my head. "You can't escape me." And that, I realized, was only the beginning. We didn't talk much after we drove away. The ride was filled with an oppressive silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The eerie presence from the apartment seemed to follow us, hanging in the air, like a thick fog that wouldn't lift. The whispering, that voice, was still inside my head. "You can't escape me." I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, the trauma of what we'd just experienced, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had followed us. I could feel it, like a cold weight pressing against my chest. When we finally arrived at Jake's place, everyone piled out of the car in a dazed rush, as if we were escaping something that might still be chasing us. We didn't even speak, we just rushed inside, all of us still shaken, still trying to process what had just happened. Jake slammed the door behind him, locking it with a trembling hand. But the moment the door clicked shut, I felt it again. The cold, suffocating presence, as if the very walls of the house were closing in on us. "Let's just sit down. We need to figure out what to do," Jake said, trying to sound calm, but his voice cracked at the end. We all gathered in his living room, our faces pale, eyes wide, as though the darkness had embedded itself in us. Mia was the first to speak. "We can't just sit here and pretend it's over," she said, her voice tight. "It's still out there. It's still with us." "I don't think it's just out there," I said, my throat dry. "It's inside us, too. It's in my head." "I heard it, too," Brian muttered, his hands fidgeting with his sleeves. "It's like, it's everywhere. No matter where we go, it's there." There was a pause as the weight of those words sank in. I wanted to deny it, to scream that we were just imagining things, but I couldn't. The feeling was too real, too heavy. Something was still out there, following us, waiting. Then, the lights flickered. It wasn't just a flicker. It was a pulse, like the electricity was breathing. The light dimmed for a split second before coming back on. I froze, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Another flicker. This time, longer. Then, the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air again. "We need to leave. Now," I said, standing up abruptly. My legs were shaking, but I couldn't sit still. I could feel it, whatever it was getting closer. Closer than it had ever been. "Wait, what about the Ouija board?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. I froze. The board. In all the chaos of trying to escape the apartment, we had forgotten to destroy it. That cursed thing, the source of all of this, was still in the back of Jake's closet. Still waiting for us. "We need to burn it," Mia said, almost hysterical. "We need to destroy it. If we don't, it's never going to end." Jake nodded, visibly shaken, but determined. "Okay, I'll go get it. But we need to do it fast." As Jake rushed to his closet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dark corners of the room. The air felt thicker now, as though the shadows were more alive than before. I could hear the rustling from the closet, then a loud thud as Jake pulled the board out. He held it up, eyes wide, staring at the thing like it was a monster. "Let's burn it," I urged, my voice tight. "Now." Without another word, Jake grabbed a lighter and lit it. The flames flickered to life, licking the edges of the board. For a moment, it seemed to fight back, the paper crackling and popping as if it didn't want to be destroyed. The room grew colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to darken even more, pressing in on us. And then, a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a low, menacing growl. It started from somewhere deep within the walls of the house, vibrating through the floor and into our bones. It was the same growl from before. The growl that had haunted us in that apartment. The flames flickered and died down, and the growl grew louder. I turned around to see the shadows in the corners of the room shifting, forming shapes. Figures. The air thickened, and the temperature plummeted. The growl grew into a growling laugh. Then, a voice, this time clearer, more distinct, filled the room. "You think burning me will stop me? You can never escape me." I turned back to the board. It was still in Jake's hands, but the flames had stopped. The board was intact. It hadn't burned at all. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't over. It wasn't just a game. This was something far worse, something ancient, and it was playing with us. "Why won't it burn?" I gasped. My voice cracked, but I couldn't stop myself. "What is it? What is it?" The room grew darker still, and the figures in the shadows took shape. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was something we could feel, a presence so strong, it made our hair stand on end. And it was right here with us, closing in. "I am everywhere." The lights went out. The growl vibrated through the floor. The figures from the shadows were here, standing in front of us, their outlines shifting and changing, as if made of darkness itself. "You are mine." And then, all at once, the temperature plummeted again. We were all frozen in place. The whispers, the growls, the shadows, they were overwhelming. It felt like the walls were closing in on us, like the very air was being sucked out of the room. "Run." This time, the voice didn't need to be heard. We felt it. And without thinking, we ran. We ran like our lives depended on it, because they did. The house, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt like a trap. The floorboards groaned under our feet, the walls closing in, the shadows warping and reaching for us. The growling voice still echoed in our heads, that ominous whisper gnawing at the edges of our thoughts. "You can't escape me." I don't know how we made it out of the house. I don't know how we found the door. But when we burst outside, into the freezing night air, it felt like a fleeting breath of freedom. We didn't even stop to look back. We just ran. I couldn't think, couldn't speak, everything was a blur of motion and terror. The night was still, too still, as though the world itself had frozen in place, holding its breath. We reached the car, but I couldn't remember getting in, couldn't remember starting it. All I knew was that I had to leave. I had to put distance between myself and whatever had followed us. Jake slammed the door, and I hit the gas, speeding down the road, as far away from that house as possible. My hands were shaking, and my chest burned with each frantic breath. But even then, I could feel it. The presence. It wasn't gone. Mia was crying, her body shaking uncontrollably. Why didn't it end? Why is it still with us? I don't know, I whispered. But it's not over. It's not. Jake was staring out the window, his eyes wide, his face pale. What the hell was that thing? What was Derek? It wasn't human. I don't know what it was. We were all staring out the windows, watching the road blur past us. The wind howled through the cracked windows, and the headlights barely pierced the thick fog that had suddenly rolled in. There was something suffocating about it. The fog wasn't natural. It was too thick, too dark. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The apartment. We were miles away, or so I thought. But there it was, looming in the fog, standing in the exact same place we had just left. It was like a nightmare, unreal, impossible, but unmistakable. I slammed on the brakes, screeching to a stop. The car jerked violently, but the headlights still shone brightly on the apartment building. And in the windows, there were figures. Not shadows, not reflections. Figures. People, or things, standing in the windows, watching us. The same figures we had seen before. The same twisted shapes. But now, they were clearer. Now, they were alive. I could feel it again, that suffocating pressure. The growl. The whispers. You can't escape me. I turned to Jake. His face had gone ashen, and his mouth opened to say something, but no words came out. The fog outside thickened. The air felt dense, almost alive. I looked at the others, but their eyes were wide with the same horror that had already taken hold of me. Mia whispered, "We're still trapped. It hasn't let us go." It was true. No matter how far we ran, no matter where we went, it followed us. It was always there, lurking in the darkness. And as much as we tried to deny it, we knew the truth. The Ouija board, Derek, whatever it wasn't just a game. It was a doorway. A door we had opened, and once it was opened, there was no shutting it. The car engine sputtered, then died. I tried to restart it, but the battery was dead. The lights flickered and went out. The only light now was from the street lamps that flickered like dying stars. And in the distance, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing in the fog, closer now. Derek? No. Not Derek. Something worse. Something ancient. The growl returned, deep and resonant, shaking the car. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. "Run," I whispered. "We need to run." But we couldn't move. We couldn't get away. The fog surrounded us, and the whispers became louder, almost deafening. I looked around desperately, my breath short, but all I could see was darkness. The world felt like it was closing in. Like we were being pulled into the very nightmare we had been trying to escape. The figure was moving closer. It wasn't human. Its shape was wrong, twisted, a blur of darkness, almost as if the fog itself was alive and breathing. And then, all at once, everything went silent. The growl. The whispers. The fog. The figure. It all vanished. I blinked, disoriented. For a moment, there was nothing. The car was still, the world was still. But in that stillness, I knew. I knew that it wasn't over. We had survived. Yes, for now. But whatever we had awakened, whatever was still following us, it wasn't done. The Ouija board, Derek, whatever it was, it had left its mark on us. It had claimed us. And it would never let us go. We never spoke of it again. We never returned to that place, never mentioned the board or the shadows we saw. But the truth haunted us. Each of us, in our own way, felt its presence. We all heard the whispers when the silence grew too loud, saw the shadows move at the edges of our vision. And no matter how far we ran, we knew one thing for sure, we had crossed a line. And there was no going back. The nightmare wasn't just a story. It was real. And it would never end.